Before we start, we'd just like to acknowledge the Yagara and Turrbal peoples as the true owners and custodians of this land, the waters and the skies. We pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. We acknowledge that access to climate misinformation is restricted by access to unbiased media, technology, and education, issues which particularly affect Indigenous peoples. I'm Claire, and on the recording, we also have Finbar, and Zoe. We are undergraduate law students at UQ and members of UQ's Pro Bono Centre. The UQ Pro Bono Centre partners with community legal centres and other organisations to provide students with the opportunity to engage in pro bono legal work. This semester, we took part in the Law Reform Project. The project is comprised of around 20 students split into smaller teams to write submissions and letters on different points of law. Our team wrote a submission to the Senate inquiry into the prevalence and impacts of misinformation and disinformation, which relates to climate change and energy. Our submission was accepted by the inquiry and is publicly available on their webpage. In our presentation today, we're going to summarise our recommendations and explain the reasoning behind them. So climate misinformation is a multifaceted issue, so we decided to tackle it from a few angles at once. Our recommendations aren't a complete blueprint, but rather a few ideas we thought could make a difference, both individually and in conjunction with other reforms. We wanted to present changes which would reduce the amount of climate mis and disinformation spread in the media and online. So we made 8 recommendations across 3 areas. Finbar and Flynn will discuss 3 potential reforms around advertising, and Zoe will address our 2 recommendations around bots and trolls. Then I'll be back to talk about our last 3 recommendations, which offer domestic reforms with international implications. I'll throw over to Flynn now so he can provide a bit of background on the nature and scope of our submission.
Thanks, Claire. Let's first define misinformation and disinformation. Misinformation is false or misleading information created and communicated without intent to deceive. Disinformation, however, exists with the intent to deceive for malicious or strategic purposes. The distinction between misinformation and disinformation is important from a policy standpoint, as regulation treating misinformation as equal to disinformation could unjustly limit freedom of expression and fail to acknowledge the greater danger malicious actors pose to climate policy and democracy as a whole. However, as Andras Kolte, a European legal researcher specializing in freedom of expression and media law, argued, regulations using intent as the distinguishing characteristic fail to account for the actual impact on public opinion, or bad faith actors using already disseminated content, like satire, which contains misinformation. For example, the Australian consumer law under Section 18, when determining if conduct is misleading or deceptive, considers intention generally irrelevant. It's your duty to not mislead in any circumstance. Of course, in a non-commercial setting, political speech cannot be regulated as such, but it's a useful framework. A University of Canberra survey found that 74% of Australians are now concerned about online misinformation. That's the highest rate globally, and it's up 10 percentage points from 5 years ago. It underlines the increasing perceived and actual harm social media sites are having on political discourse, especially in the climate change and energy space, which continues to be at the forefront of politics after the federal election. Advertisements, bots and trolls, and international actors are significant sources of climate misinformation and disinformation and have found mediums particularly in social media and lobbying. Large actors, including fossil fuel firms, have used advertisements since the 1970s to downplay climate change, delay renewable energy adoption, and employ greenwashing claims to misinform the public. Finbar will dive into the prevalence of astroturfing campaigns in the last election. Bots. They increasingly contribute to the online discourse on climate change. A 2017 study of Twitter posts around the US withdrawal from the Paris Agreement found a quarter of posts were made by bots who disproportionately shared denialist views, whereas only 4.7% of tweets supporting climate change action were from bots. During the 2019-2020 bushfires in Australia, false claims of arson as the root cause of the fires were shared by thousands of users, of which the vast majority were human and Australian, underlining the increasing and significant role trolls played domestically alongside bots. The consequence of prevalent climate and energy misinformation and disinformation is appreciated when analysing the disruption and cancellation of Australian renewable energy projects. Equinor, a Norwegian energy company, did not proceed with its planned offshore wind farms in the Bass Strait and Hunter region after facing what appears to be a politically motivated hold order on a New York wind project from the US government, which cost the company millions. An anti-offshore wind campaign with claims including that offshore turbines would kill whales led the government in 2024 to downsize and push the Illawarra offshore wind zone further offshore. Another example is a major 1.3 gigawatt wind project in New South Wales, despite receiving a consensus of local support, faced 72 non-local objections, which triggered an assessment by New South Wales Independent Planning Commission. In some cases, projects face up to $100 million in state-level approval costs as a result. Finbar will now consider avenues for electoral reform around advertising.
Thanks, Flynn. I'll be discussing some legislative strategies for managing when political groups or corporations run fake grassroots movements or astroturfing. We focused on three in our submission: Mums for Nuclear, Australians for Prosperity, and Australians for Natural Gas. The last election, they spent $62,000, $274,000, and $54,000 in advertising respectively, and received 1.3 million, 25.2 million, and 3.4 million impressions across social media platforms. Further, Australians for Prosperity benefited from significant funding from the coal industry. Likewise, Australians for Natural Gas has been found to have links with the gas industry as well as conservative political groups. Finally, there are also some reasonable suggestions that these astroturfers are part of a global campaign coordinated by fossil fuel-funded international think tanks like the Atlas Network. Altogether, these groups are problematic because they use their false grassroots appearance to legitimize mis and disinformation and use their significant resources to spread it widely. Therefore, I'll discuss two recommendations for reforms to electoral laws, while Flynn will discuss possible social media regulation. Our first recommendation is the introduction of truth in political advertising laws. They've been present in South Australia since 1985 and the ACT since 2020, and under them the publication of facts, which are false or misleading to a material extent, is an offence. Broadly, I think it's fair to say that advertisers should be and politicians should be that astroturfers and politicians should be held to the same standard as advertisers. If implemented, truth in political advertising laws would effectively prevent astroturfing campaigns from using advertisements to disseminate mis and disinformation. There are generally two arguments against the laws. The first is that they are incompatible with free democratic discourse. Four things to note in response. First, the law only impacts advertisement. General political discourse is unaffected. Secondly, the regulation only applies where advertisement is materially inaccurate or misleading, so intervention is proportional and reasonable. Third, just like in general advertising, puffery is still allowed. It's only when a politician makes a claim to fact that regulation comes into play. Finally, from a legal standpoint, both ACT and South Australian regulation have been found to be broadly compatible with Australia's constitutional freedom of political communication. The second criticism of truth in political advertising laws is around their feasibility. This, however, is unsupported by what we've seen empirically in South Australia. There, the laws have been in place for 40 years and are widely regarded as having been effective at identifying and policing advertisement and receive broad cooperation from advertisers. Therefore, truth in political advertising laws will be an effective and proportional reform. Our second recommendation is to amend the definition of electoral matter in the Commonwealth Electoral Act. This is important because it determines whether the Act applies, and therefore where the truth in political advertising laws would come into play. Electoral matter is defined as matter intended primarily to influence the outcome of an election, including by promoting or opposing a political group or politician. Importantly, astroturfing campaigns generally don't endorse candidates or parties and instead focus on influencing electors' perception of issues. While the definition of electoral matter in theory could still apply, in practice many escape regulation. This is the case in the AEC investigation of Mums to Nuclear. As a result, we recommended the introduction of the definition and the ACT regulation, where matter with reference to an issue connected to the election is an electoral matter. If truth in political advertising laws were to be ineffective, a broadened definition would be necessary. Even if they were not implemented though, a broadened definition would still be beneficial. Publications of electoral matters are required to provide the location and identity of their authorizing entity. And one of the big issues facing policymakers right now is just not knowing enough about who is behind their campaigns. Of course, astroturfing campaigns might provide information about intermediary groups instead. And indeed, this is a possibility under current regulation. So we also recommended that these requirements be tightened up. Finally, though, it should be noted that mis and disinformation are spread outside of elections, and we've seen this over debates about wind farms. Therefore, I'll pass it over to Flynn to discuss some solutions for this.
Thanks, Finbar. While the previous recommendations dealt with electoral advertisements, what happens when misinformation and disinformation campaigns are run for non-electoral purposes? They can still campaign against renewable energy projects and significantly burden the renewable energy transition. So our third recommendation for combating astroturfing is the introduction of mandatory review and removal of advertisements found to contain climate misinformation or disinformation on social media platforms. An important aspect of a mandatory internal review requirement would be ensuring transparency in communications to ensure fairness for all parties. Transparency should also extend to the public, with social media platforms being required to produce public, up-to-date ad libraries. Google and Meta make billions of ads in Australia. If they profit off it, they can police it. Zoe will now discuss regulatory avenues around bots and trolls.
Thanks, Flynn. The spread of climate misinformation on social media has evolved into something far more sophisticated. Today, it's powered by a coordinated network of bots and troll-like accounts pushing false narratives that create confusion and undermine climate action. These fake accounts flood feeds with misleading content, often framing climate change as a political agenda or claiming that environmental policies threatens people's rights or way of life. Unlike human users, there is no constitutional free speech for bots, giving regulators greater scope to limit their activities. But the reality is that social media platforms are struggling to keep up with the scale of automated campaigns. Speech should be free, but it should also be human. This leaves climate disinformation a persistent challenge for both technical and policy solutions. Currently, Australia's regulatory environment is insufficient to address the complexity of climate misinformation. In 2021, Australia introduced a voluntary framework, the Australian Code of Practice on Disinformation and Misinformation. It was designed to promote transparency and accountability in attempts to address the public's concern about online falsehoods. While the code is a forward for misinformation management in the media, the code still lacks enforcement power and comprehensive coverage. This allows significant misinformation campaigns to continue being unchallenged. To address these challenges, our fourth recommendation is to implement mandatory detection and removal of non-human users communicating misinformation by large platforms. It is imperative that efforts to control bots do not end up silencing real people. To ensure this, there must be clear and consistent standards for determining when an account is non-human, so that platforms do not cause significant harm through misidentification. To avoid jurisdictional overreach, platforms should not be required to remove every offending bot worldwide. Instead, legislation should focus directly on bot accounts that originate in Australia or those that directly influence Australian political discussions or elections through misinformation. Our fifth recommendation is to consider international best practice to limit the spread of disinformation on large platforms. Legislative measures that target human-spread misinformation on social media must comply with human rights obligations like privacy protections and the freedom of political communication. These safeguards prevent overly broad regulation of misinformation. While that can allow false information to spread more easily online, it ultimately ensures that laws do not become disproportionate or infringe on protected speech. International instruments that enforce transparency, especially those aimed at exposing inauthentic behaviour, offer valuable models for Australia to adapt. A strong example is the European Union's Digital Services Act, or DSA. The DSA pushes large platforms to take concrete steps towards greater accountability from using algorithms to detect false content to reporting organized misinformation efforts. It also requires platforms to conduct thorough risk assessments, release mitigation plans, and participate in independent audits to demonstrate compliance. The DSA shows that it is possible to increase transparency while still protecting freedom of expression. It manages to curb disinformation without overstepping or limiting legitimate speech. This balanced approach is something that Australia could adapt, with clear rules, independent oversight, and real accountability that avoids government overreach. At the end of the day, our goal is simple: empower real people, not programs. Now I will pass it on to Claire, who will discuss the macro approach.
Cool. Thank you, Zoe. Our final three recommendations focus on domestic reforms with international implications. It's not just ecosystems that extend beyond borders, it's the internet, the economy, and multinational corporations. Cross-jurisdictional issues therefore require a cross-jurisdictional approach. Our sixth recommendation pertains to Australia's participation in international institutions. In 2024, UNESCO partnered with the Brazilian government to establish the Global Initiative for Information Integrity on Climate Change. This was in response to commitments made in the Global Digital Compact, a UN initiative designed to support governments to assess the impact of mis- and disinformation on the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. As a UN member state, Australia is a party to the compact and should therefore participate in the global initiative. The initiative will create a global fund to finance research into disinformation and support climate change education and advocacy for information integrity. So we all know that large corporations with stakes in fossil fuel production like to obscure information about climate change. Profit above planet, and the shareholder comes first. Disinformation from oil companies dates back to the 1970s, as Flynn discussed. And if you've ever walked past the cleaning aisle at a grocery store, you'll be familiar with greenwashing. But corporations have a bigger toolbox than that. They also provide disinformation through their sustainability reports, their public relations campaigns, partisan policy briefs, and their own networking links. As a result, we recommend strengthening the Corporations Act provisions for misleading and unreliable conduct to limit disinformation and misinformation spread by fossil fuel companies. On screen, you can see two models that can be used to draft restrictions on climate misinformation. The first is Section 1041H of the Corporations Act, which is on greenwashing. And the other is Sections 18 to 21 of the Corporations Act, of the Australian Consumer Law, which provides general protections for consumers against misleading and deceptive conduct and unconscionable conduct by a person engaging in trade or commerce. So fossil fuel companies have demonstrated contradictory attitudes towards climate policy. They engage in anti-climate action advocacy while presenting a climate-positive attitude publicly. The International Panel on the Information Environment found that policymakers were targeted by lobby groups in misinformation campaigns. These lobby groups are part of a global influence network backed by industries with a stake in preventing energy transition. So to combat the ongoing influence of fossil fuel companies, we recommend restricting their participation in climate science roundtables and government partnerships. Provisions similar to those implemented in response to Australia's ratification of the WHO Framework Convention on Tobacco Control provide a workable and appropriate model so that companies with a direct stake in the industry do not have a say in Australia's climate policy and development. So here's a summary of our recommendations. If you're interested in reading our whole submission, they're published on the Select Committee's website, and we're submission number 63. There's a QR code there if you'd like quick access. The inquiry has been holding public submissions recently, and their report is due to be released in March. over 40% of the published submissions were associated with organizations or individuals supporting climate denial. So the threat of climate misinformation and disinformation is evidently not diminishing. Thank you all for listening. Before we go, we'd also like to thank Professor Matthew Rimmer for the opportunity to speak. We're very honoured and delighted to be invited. And if you have any inquiries, then you can contact us through the Pro Bono Centre. The contact information is also on screen there. Thank you so much.